Right? Tanse, kakio, Benjamin Nitsikatson, Miskuchi Wiskaga Nuchinia, Kinanaskum now. Hello, my name is Benjamin Kucher. I am from a place called Beaver Hills House, or as some of you might know it, Edmonton, Alberta. I thought I told you no yelling this time. I am an Indigenous archaeologist at the University of Alberta, and I'm here today to talk to you about how archaeology can be used to support Indigenous sovereignty. And in the spirit of sharing our knowledge, I'm going to do it in what my people are best at, is telling you a story. And so I'll tell you the story of how my people have used archaeology. But before we get started, I'm going to pass around this sash. This is the symbol of my people. This is something that we have finger woven for years. It represents our people. There are different styles depending on which province in Canada you are on, and each colored thread means something different. And so as this gets passed around, I'll explain the colors for you. So the red represents the blood of our people. That goes into all of the work that we do. The blue represents the water. The yellow represents joy. The green represents the earth that we live on. And the white represents the spirit. This is something that my people have always worn. We are part of the fur trade, and that is when we emerged in Canada. And so this was a tool that we kept on us at all times. It could be used as a belt to hold up your pants. It could be used to pull things along, haul things along. And I think the most utilized version of it is those little threads on the end. If you were out in the field doing work and you split your pants, or you ripped a hole in your shirt, you could just cut off a thread and sew the hole. And so now we'll get into the story of my people. But I want you to picture the context of where my people live, because it is not the coast. We are in a very dry prairie land. So I want you to imagine the sun rising over rolling prairies. The long grass is swaying gently in the morning breeze. And in the distance, you see the faint outline of the North Saskatchewan River, shimmering as it winds its way throughout the land. These prairies, rivers, and forests are more than just geographical locations. They are the backbone of a history that stretches back centuries. This is Métis land, where communities once thrived through a deep connection to both the land and the waterways that served as our vital trade routes. I want you to picture a bustling scene along riverbanks where Métis families gathered, along Red River carts that were loaded with furs, creaking under their weight, and the smell of wood smoke rising from chimneys of log cabins. The land and the people were intertwined in this harmonious relationship. The Métis thriving as intermediaries in the fur trade, blending both in European and Indigenous cultures into something that is uniquely our own. The fight for Métis sovereignty is something that continues today, but this connection to the land hasn't always been recognized. Over centuries, colonial governments and policies worked to undermine our sovereignty, displacing families, erasing histories. But however, the Métis as a people have resisted. We have resisted this erasure, holding on to our cultural heritage and reclaiming the land and rights piece by piece. And I'll share with you a story that an elder always tells me when we talk about getting the land back. Doesn't matter how long it takes or how much work it takes, or if she even has to buy it back bag by bag of soil from the garden center, she will get her land back. And so this is where archaeology can come in as a tool. So archaeology has traditionally been a colonial tool and has turned into a method for empowerment. And through the Métis, we will explore how archaeology can be used to reclaim our stories, affirm our sovereignty, and pass on our heritage for future generations. Through Métis-specific examples, I will show you how archaeology has the power to not only empower, but also strengthen cultural identity and influence policy. And so now we're going to go back to the 19th century, about when the Métis emerged as a people. So imagine the Métis community nestled along the Red River. It's early autumn, and the landscape is filled with vibrant colors of golden grasses, fiery red shrubs, and deep green forests like the ones that we can see out the window here. In the distance, you can hear the sounds of the buffalo hunt. The Métis were historic for buffalo hunts, gathering families from 15 to 20, coming to close to 200 to 300 people. We've all gathered and after the hunt, and we're bringing in food for the long winter ahead. There is laughter, music from fiddles, and if we have time today, I'll play a little bit of our fiddle music. And children running alongside these Red River carts that groan under the weight of the furs that were destined for Hudson's Bay Trading Company posts. This itself was Métis sovereignty in action. It was self-sufficiency, cultural preservation, and control over trade. The Métis were often referred as the people of the buffalo, or as we call ourselves, the Otipemisiwak, the people who govern themselves. We governed our own lives, managed our own resources, and passed down our cultural traditions through generations. And this sovereignty itself wasn't just political. It was cultural, economic, and it was directly tied to the land. Now imagine this same scene being disrupted. Over the years, colonial governments have ignored Métis land claims, displacing their families and cutting them off from the economic lifeblood of the fur trade. Policies were introduced to assimilate Métis and other Indigenous people into settler society, erasing our distinct cultural identity. Yet despite these challenges, the Métis people resisted. We fought for our rights through legal battles, through political organizing, and even through armed resistances during the Northwest Resistance. In other words, we went and we shot the Canadian government when they weren't listening. This resilience is central to the Métis sovereignty, and today archaeology has played a central role in reclaiming this past. But like I said, archaeology wasn't always a tool for empowerment, and we have to acknowledge the dark past of archaeology. And it always, in its early days, served colonial interests. In the late 1800s, archaeologists arrived on the prairies, and they didn't see a land that belonged to the Indigenous people. Instead, they saw an uncharted territory, a blank canvas on which they can write their own stories. As they were tilling the land, they dug up artifacts that included trade beads, arrowheads, and other tools, without asking permission, without understanding the cultural significance of these items, and without consulting the people to whom they belonged. These artifacts, once tied everyday lives of Métis families, were taken and displaced and then displayed in a museum, which was often in Europe or in Eastern Canada, far from the communities that created them and who they had a history with. They were stripped of the context, presented as relics of a past that was supposedly long gone, ignoring the fact that Métis people are still very much alive and active in our communities. The narrative that archaeology promoted during this period wasn't one of resilience or sovereignty. It was one of disappearance and colonial domination. When archaeology was taking form in the early days of Canada, it was seen as salvage archaeology, trying to save and preserve the culture of a people that were dying. Well, guess what? We're still here. We're not going anywhere. So as a tool of colonization, archaeology was a way to legitimize settler claims to the land and to erase the presence of Indigenous people. But as with all stories, this narrative began to change. If we fast forward to today, archaeology is undergoing a transformation, where Indigenous voices that were once silenced or ignored are now leading the way. We are reclaiming the field of archaeology. Decolonizing archaeology is about shifting the power dynamics, about challenging who gets to tell the story and how it is told. So imagine an excavation site along the banks of the South Saskatchewan River. But this time, the scene is different. The Métis community is not just present, they are the ones leading the dig. Elders stand by, guiding researchers and sharing stories passed down through generations. And the young Métis students are on site, not learning only about archaeology, but about their own history and heritage. The community decides what is important to study, and how these objects should be handled, and what should be done with the findings. And this is at the heart of community-based archaeology, a process that honors Indigenous knowledge and ensures that the people who are closest to the history are the ones telling it. The shift from archaeology being a tool of extraction to a tool of empowerment is a critical step in supporting Indigenous sovereignty, because it's no longer about outsiders coming in to discover the past. It's about Indigenous people reclaiming their stories, their histories, and their futures. And so one of the most powerful examples of archaeology that supports Métis sovereignty comes from a place called Batoche, Saskatchewan. Batoche is a sacred site for us as the Métis, because it is where the Northwest Resistance took place in 1885. It was here where Métis families like mine, led by Louis Riel and Gabriel Dumont, fought to defend our land and our way of life against the Canadian government. And this site holds immense cultural and historical significance for us. And each year we hold a gathering called Back to Batoche, where we gather as families and we share recipes and stories. For decades, Métis people, we have worked with archaeologists to excavate Batoche, uncovering the remains of Métis houses, farm tools, and even musket balls from the Great Battle. These artifacts have provided a concrete evidence of Métis occupation and our struggle for sovereignty. Archaeological digs at Batoche have not only helped support our land claims, but have also reinforced the Métis Nation's connection to the land. The findings at Batoche are used in education programs, helping to teach Métis youth about the bravery and resilience of our ancestors. But Batoche is more than a historical site. It's a living symbol of the Métis people's ongoing fight for reconciliation and our rights. The archaeology done here is more than just about recovering artifacts. It's about reclaiming our identity. Another example of archaeology supporting Métis sovereignty is the repatriation of cultural artifacts. For many years, artifacts such as intricate beadwork, clothing, and everyday tools have been housed in museums far from their communities of origin. And these objects were often taken without permission and displayed in ways that are disconnected from their cultural context. In other words, they do not tell the story of what it was actually used for. I think I remember seeing in a museum in Alberta a little wooden handle of a tool that was supposedly belonging to an axe, and it was actually the pin of a Red River cartwheel. So these artifacts, when they were extracted, were not taken and understood in the way that they were used. It was simply whatever the traditionally white archaeologists thought it was used for. But in recent years, the Métis Nation has worked with museums to identify these artifacts, and we found artifacts from as far out as the Vatican. A lot of our beadwork and our sashes are sitting in the archives of the Vatican, and we have no access to them. We don't even get to see them through picture or email. We've actually found that a few of these artifacts are on a Vatican eBay site up for sale. So how do we repatriate these artifacts? Imagine the emotional moment when an item that had been missing for decades, like a sash or a piece of beadwork, is returned to the community it belongs to. These items are not just objects. They are the tangible links to our history, our heritage, and our identity. Their return is a reclaiming of sovereignty, a way to ensure that the Métis people have control over our own cultural heritage. Now many of these repatriated items are displayed in community museums. In St. Albert, which is about 20 minutes outside of Edmonton, there's a museum called Musée Héritage, and a lot of the artifacts in that museum were my ancestors' belongings. There's a beaded hunting gauntlet, a vest, and other objects. In addition to community museums, these objects are being used in their traditional ceremonies and being passed down to Métis youth as part of cultural education programs. And so, returning to community-based archaeology, it's not just about digging up artifacts. It's about forging a partnership between Métis communities and archaeologists, where our knowledge is prioritized and respected. It's about working together to ensure that the work being done benefits the community and aligns with their goals. And to go to St. Albert again, this past summer, a community-led archaeology project uncovered valuable information about an early Métis settlement and the role it played in the fur trade network. These settlements were once vibrant hubs of economic and social life, and the project involved Métis elders, community leaders, youth, combining oral histories with archaeological evidence to build a fuller, better picture of the Métis experience. So this project did not just add to academic knowledge. It strengthened the community's connection to our past and empowered us to tell our own stories in our own way. And so this is the future of archaeology, a future where the stories of the land are told by those who have lived on it for generations. But the power of archaeology doesn't end at an excavation site or in a museum. The evidence being used from archaeological digs is being used to shape public policy and support Indigenous rights in legal cases. In the Red River settlement, archaeological research provided a tangible proof of continuous Métis occupation to the land. This evidence has been used to support the land claims and help with the establishment of the Manitoba Métis Federation, helping us to assert our rights to our land and our resources. In other words, these findings have real-world impacts. They shape the legal arguments that underpin Indigenous sovereignty, and archaeologists are working in partnership with these communities, and they play an important role as advocates for Indigenous rights. They can help to ensure that Métis voices are heard in the courts, in public policy, and in the wider world. And so as we've seen, archaeology is more than just a study of the past. It's a tool for reclaiming the future. For the Métis people, archaeology is more than about discovering artifacts. It's about using those discoveries to assert our rights, strengthen our cultural identity, and influence policy. And so the work of decolonizing archaeology is ongoing. For the Métis, it has been a key part of reclaiming sovereignty, of ensuring that our stories are told by them, for us, and with us. And this goes back to an underpinning of archaeology that I was taught in my early years as an undergrad. You don't do anything about us without us. And so we must work to support Indigenous communities in their effort to reclaim our past, and through that, our future. And so I want to leave you all with this question, and we'll open it up to questions here. How will you support Indigenous sovereignty in your work and in your community? The stories of Indigenous people are still being written, and we all have a role to play in ensuring that these stories are honored and respected. So let's continue the conversation by opening this up to questions and explore how we can contribute to supporting Indigenous sovereignty in meaningful and impactful ways. Thank you. We'll open it up to questions and I'll run the mic over. Or I can pass it because I think you've got some brewing.
So, I can talk to you. What? Oh, for that, I'm sorry. I don't know how to use it. You just hold it? Oh, okay, you just talk. Okay, well, that scares me. How did you get started in your path, archaeology? Was it an interest in your culture, or was it an interest in archaeology, or both?
I think it's a bit of both, but I'll share that when I started my undergrad, straight out of high school, I was planning to become a doctor. I started in med school. I was sitting in chemistry classes and realizing that this, while it's important to understand the science of things, it wasn't making a real-world impact for me. And so I did always have an interest in history, and I thought about going into a history program, but I needed something tangible. And so that's when archaeology came in. And where I've gone down this path of working in Indigenous archaeology is being able to see the past of my people and other Indigenous people coming back. A lot of times things of the past get buried, and that's the last you see of them, the last you hear of them. And that is what has contributed to the stories of Indigenous people, quote, disappearing. But we're not disappearing. We're just telling our stories in different ways. I can go on about this stuff for all day.
I know, right? Right. Yeah, my daughter was going to college in Maine, and she tried to do, to do a little exhibit on the Native people from the place where she was. And one thing that she found was that Native people in the 20th century tried not to be seen, because of discrimination, which just contributed to this kind of disappearance or this myth of, and because they knew if they did, identify as Native, they would be discriminated against. And that was in Maine in the 20th century.
Yeah, I think it's something that we're seeing all over the world. There's really this resurgence of maybe the threat isn't as prominent as it once was, and so we can come out and tell our stories. Back to this side. I feel like this might have went shorter than an hour. Oh, over there, we got 2.
I apologize for my tardiness. I was watching the spelling bee downstairs. You might have already touched on this, but as a historic preservationist, I was just talking to an archaeologist about the flood and the water levels and how archaeology is looking towards our current shorelines. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what is being done to look into the mountains where that shoreline would have been hundreds and thousands of years ago.
So coastal erosion has been a big problem for a couple years now, and archaeologists have really been trying to figure out ways that we can preserve the sites, because there are some coastal communities that don't want their things excavated, but at the risk of losing it all to the oceans and all the erosion that's happening. We're working with different communities in identifying what the sites are the priorities to be preserved and what to do with these objects. In terms of what's coming up in the mountain ranges, I am not sure. That is more somebody else's field. I'm more what's on the ground or on the coast.
I'm sorry, I should have been more clear. What I mean is that the water level was at a point in the mountains. That's where the activity happened. And now our water level has receded so much with the glaciers pushing back that maybe we're not looking in the right places. And I was wondering what archaeology is doing to find the right places.
All right, it's kind of the opposite. I was talking about water levels rising. All right, so with water levels receding and trying to find sites, a lot of what happens in the realm of Indigenous archaeology is sometimes an archaeologist will know in a general sense where things were, but they can't always locate it. And so that's where the role of community comes in, people who know the stories, who can take archaeologists to the sites and pinpoint what exactly we're looking for.
This kind of relates to the topic that you touched on of repatriating artifacts to the communities that they belong to and the lands that they belong to. But I was wondering if you had, like, what your perspective was on, like maybe what is the role or responsibility that museums can play or should play in, like, in educating or making accessible all the things that we can learn from these artifacts, while also maintaining respect towards the rightful owners and the cultures that they belong to.
So I think what that comes down to, museums play a huge role, and one of the ways that we can make things accessible is for museums to take what they have in their collections and make them into an online database so that people are aware of what's there. Because a lot of times in the historical record of keeping what these artifacts are, you don't get a name of what it is. You get something like DJO-10 whatever, the artifact number. That, to a community member, that could mean nothing. And so really identifying what's there and making it accessible. In terms of the preservation of it, I think that comes down to which community it belonged to and what they would like to see done with it. And I'll give you an example of what just recently happened last year in BC of a nation that was trying to repatriate a totem pole from Sweden. When they approached the museum for repatriation of this totem pole, they were told, you can't have it because you don't have somewhere safe to keep it preserved. You don't have a controlled environment. Now, the community's belief was that when the totem pole degrades and returns to the earth, that is what happens to it. There is no need to preserve it. So one of the ways that they ended up negotiating that, and that totem pole was repatriated last year, is that a community member carved a replica of the totem pole that was sent to the museum in Sweden, and the original was sent home. That's the hard one.
Thank you, Ben. Could you speak at all to how the fires in Canada are affecting archaeology or archaeological work, especially in areas of prairie, muskeg, where the fires are quite prevalent?
Yeah, I think one of the areas that are really impacting with the fires is with radiocarbon dating. Because of these fires, the dates are now no longer correct, and we're having to recalibrate and really rely on some of the work that's been previously done. One of the other ways that it's impacting, much like the coastlines eroding, is that the fires are exposing new things. And we're finding things that we maybe have seen in the written record but didn't think actually existed or had been lost forever, and now they're reemerging.
I think this would be more of a what's your opinion as opposed to a question, but I'm really curious how, we could use archaeology as a tool to help correct some of the misinformation that's in our history books and being taught. But you're from Canada, so I'm not sure, how the laws are, but if you were in the position and it were you and your people, where would you start?
So I love opinion questions, and we do have different archaeology laws, and it actually varies province to province. One of the ways that I would probably approach this, and it's something that a colleague of mine is doing, so in parts of southern Alberta, it's been claimed through policy and law that the Métis people were never in southern Alberta, and we don't have our inherent rights there. So my colleague is looking at place names, and there is a place down in southern Alberta called Half-Breed Creek. And with the Métis being half Indigenous, half European, they named it that for a reason. We were down there. And so collecting information and data like that and bringing it to lawmakers to be like, no, we were here, here's the proof. And then pushing them to change those policies, to change those laws.
Again, in historic preservation, I'm trying to find ways of indigenizing a Western education that I've gotten, and I was wondering if you'd like to speak to how you would approach putting an Indigenous blanket over your Western education.
Yeah, I love that question, and that is something that I think we're still doing a lot of work on. One of the ways that I'm doing it back home is through the way that artifacts are cataloged. So a lot of the catalog systems are personal adornment, housing, things like that. And the way we're changing that is talking to Indigenous communities of, well, what was your community using this for? And reclassifying the way that it's organized in a system and really creating an Indigenous inventory.
I don't know even where to start with this because I was involved in On Your Knees Cave for the second summer of the 3-summer project that it was. And On Your Knees Cave was a cave on Prince of Wales Island where human remains were found that were 10,300 years old. We had some incredible people from the Forest Service who followed NAGPRA to the letter. We had John Autry from the Ketchikan Ranger District. We had Terry Fifield from the Craig Ranger District on Prince of Wales, and Jim Batestall from the Thorn Bay Ranger District. He was more into, Batestall was more into the geology of it. And you were asking about sea levels. The cave was 430 feet elevation. And that's about where the water was. Jim went on to develop a model, computer models, to show where sites may be at the present water level, where they may have been at the higher water level. And there has been some work. See, Alaska is involved in trying to recruit people to work on the underwater stuff. And there was a little submarine that went down, and they think they found like a weir or rock weir or something. So more work needs to be done on things that have been covered up by water. But the 3 men that I mentioned were very concerned about making sure that Native people were involved. They had to meet with the local communities, Ketchikan area, Petersburg area, Wrangell area, and the communities on Prince of Wales. And what the communities decided is that they needed to just have one community that would kind of represent all of them, and they selected Klawak. to be and they gave all their waivers in writing to Klawat that they could make any decisions that needed to be made. So that happened all ahead of time. And if there were anything found that in the way of human stuff, they would have to stop, and NAGBR would say that too, and then consult with the communities to see how they wanted to proceed with that. So while there was digging going on inside the cave, there was digging going on the outside. The paleontologist from University of South Dakota was doing the inside work, and his name was Tim Heaton. And he brought his little crew of 5 guys from the university, students. And then Jim Dixon was doing the outside, and that's where I was asked to be a part of his crew working on the outside for the archaeology part. And Tim Heaton on the inside found a little site that was a ring of rocks with a mussel shell, big tall one that you don't find here that size anymore in Southeast Alaska, and what looked like a human hand, the bones that were left that were within that ring right next to the mussel shell. And I'd never seen anything like that. Nobody had ever heard of anything like that. So he stopped because we didn't know if that was a human hand or not. Tim stayed up all night researching, and then in the morning he told us it was a bear paw because the joint, there was a little indentation in the joints where the claw can retract over that spot. So we didn't have to stop, but there was communication with the Forest Service every morning in the way of a weather report. That was how we could communicate with Terry Fifield to say weather's fine, or it looks like the clouds are coming in, or some way, because we weren't supposed to be communicating anything else. So that was kind of our secret message to say all is well today. When we did discover the bones, I can't remember how they worded it, but it had something to do with the weather. But that was, I worked at Middle Year in '98, and I was impressed with the way that those 3 men were so in tune to the communities and did, at the end of the season, they had to make a report to Klawak. And if Klawak said, well, this is significant stuff, maybe you should go to some of the other communities as well. I went to a meeting just a few years ago here in Sitka, and I was really disturbed by the comments of people who were not really involved in it nowadays, but they would hear things. And somewhere between the time that I had worked on that cave and just a few years ago, it seems there's been a collapse in that understanding of consult with the people. I liked what you said, you can do it, but not without us. Somewhere in that time frame, that seemed to get lost. And so there was this movement here with a meeting in Sitka by First Nations Institute and people who had been involved in anthropology, maybe not so much archaeology, to try and come up with some rules on that had to be established in order for people to continue with actually digging around. But I didn't see any disrespect at all when I was involved with the On Your Knees Cave. And prior to that, the fall before, I was asked to be working on the site in Craig. That one was 1,000 years old. And I saw nothing but the same kind of respect from those 3 men to always consult and ask what the stories are. And Craig, the people of Craig said, hey, there might be something there, but we've had some tsunamis come through, and that's why there's a lot of sand right there. But there's something underneath, because there used to be stories of the houses out on that island, which is now connected to the city proper of Craig. So the caving class at UAS Ketchikan was asked if they wanted to be involved in doing the dirty work, and yeah, I'll do it. So there were a lot of us that went out there at the end of October, and those of you who live in the southeast know what end of October weather is like. Yeah, you wear 5 layers because you're down belly on the ground. And we found evidence of smokehouses and drying racks because we could see the oil drips. Very methodical, like something was hanging there and dripping down because the oil marks were still there. A shell midden of the foods that they were eating, and a midden is simply the trash pile for your fish, and a lot of sea urchin. It was interesting to find the needles, the spikes or whatever they're called. We found a beaver tooth that had a carving in it. It had a hole, like maybe that was hung on something. So the city wanted to make a concession stand between the two ballparks, and that's why we were asked to go in that area and do the digging first before somebody started digging with a big backhoe and whatever, and then have to stop and investigate. So we did that. They held off on their concession stand, and our work was just a week long, long days, to just see is there something there? And then that's when I was asked, you seem to like that kind of stuff. Can you come and work on your knees cave for that second year? But a lot of things you brought up have, they're good questions. And I did not see any problems with what we were doing, how we were doing it, and the attitude of the 3 men representing the Forest Service at the time. But I do see it now because there are a lot of questions, and maybe the people that are involved nowadays don't have that same kind of, they're younger and just maybe haven't been exposed to the values, and maybe they don't understand it or feel it as much as these 3 men. They were older. They were my age at that time, so they had, I think, a deeper appreciation for, stories count. Whereas nowadays, science says it has to be quantifiable, and they're not looking to the stories. But these 3 men would sit down with the community councils, and they'd say, I want to hear your stories. And I think that makes a big difference, that there's a relationship that developed, and it was a trusting relationship that was built. They knew they would come to them if something was found. They knew they would come to the councils at the end of the season before we even left the island. They were already having meetings telling them this is what we did on that. So there was always a report to them first before the newspapers got a hold of you, or the university got a hold of you, or any other federal agency got a hold of them. And if you want to, there is a video that you can get online on YouTube, and it's his spirit is looking out from the cave, that talks about some of what went on. It's not everything. Denver Museum videographers, when they came up and did most of that filming, and then the See, Alaska got a hold of it, they put some money into it, and then the National Park Service was going to be celebrating their 100th year anniversary, so they pitched in some money to finish it so they could be the first to show it at their celebration in DC. See, Alaska has the rights to it now. So they wanted more things added. So Terry Fifield had been interviewed in that. But once it became official that they wanted them in there, then he had to go, they had to redo it, so he had to put on his uniform. You know, a lot of feds have a problem with rules. So I just want to say that I could hear what you're saying, you know, and we were there once. And sometimes we just have to help each other realize, help the ones that don't know our values, that don't understand it, don't know how to look at it, you know, so that there can be more of a trusting relationship of it instead of a us and them kind of thing. I think that will go a long way toward more collaboration that isn't confrontational. Yeah, because I just didn't see it. I think those guys did everything possible to make sure that the Native people were always there, always informed. In fact, the year that the human remains are found was the same year that the Kennewick man was found. And 10 years later, we had a ceremony in Craig, and the human remains were brought back, put in a bentwood box and buried on the tip of an island across from Klawock so that the people can always see who's coming and going over there, so that it would be protected, because if it did go back into the cave, it's kind of difficult to get to that cave, and Poor Protection was the closest, but there's different ways to get up to that one, and they didn't have to go through Poor Protection, so there was no way to have it monitored. So Klawock said, yeah, we'd rather have it here so we can watch over. So we had that ceremony, and we all got a copy, not all 12 copies, but each of us worked at the cave, got one resin copy of a point, hunting spear point, or a microblade for our time there. In the Klawock school, high school got the complete set. So it's there. But it was moving on to that other aspect of education, because I was teaching Alaska Studies at the time. And that's why I was asked to be a part of that, because I was an educated female Native teaching in the public school system, Alaska Studies. And so I brought that aspect into the classroom, but I was called into the superintendent's office not too much later and said I had to stop. Could not do that. And so I questioned the superintendent. It was kind of strange because it didn't come through the principal. I was called to the superintendent's office. That's superintendent is the principal's boss, so you got to go. So I said, may I ask why? I mean, this is perfect. He said, but too many parents are calling and saying there's no livelihood in archaeology. It's not going to make any money, so we don't want you talking about it. So, I mean, I would sneak things in once in a while, but I had to be careful. I'd lose my job for disobeying the superintendent. So, when I was listening to Peter Stanton yesterday, I asked him later, what's it like now? Because he's teaching the Alaska Studies program in Ketchikan. He said, I have carte blanche. I can do anything I want. So the schools has come a long way, because I had to fight for everything. I couldn't use the word culture in the class. I had to be careful about what I said about the different Native groups in Alaska. So things were still kind of tough, and I thought, well, maybe the other artifacts that we found in the cave would be okay. Still wasn't okay. So to see that Peter can teach anything he wants now, but he doesn't have that experience I did of working in the cave and finding the human remains, finding the tools, finding the animals that were up to 35, 45,000 years ago, then a big gap, but nothing lived from about 13 to 35,000 years ago. There's no evidence, just a lot of dirt, clay, and then all of a sudden there's human remains and totally different animals. And I was talking with the group that comes from Buffalo. They've been here a couple of times, glaciologists, volcanologists, all kinds of science people. And they told me that that site is the only place in the world that has evidence of these kind of animals that we don't find here anymore. Then nothing, and then the post-ice age or tail end of the last ice age. To have all of that in one place. But, you know, it takes education of the people that you want to be collaborating with. And I'd rather see a collaboration rather than rules put on them. Because nobody likes to be backed in a corner and you're not coming out until you can do number one, you can do number two, you can do number three. And that's hard because it takes a lot of work to build that trust first so that you could both go in and get the work done. So I wish you well on your career. You're still young. I retired in 2004, so I'm way past that, but I still have a lot of good memories of things that worked, you know. And the men I was working with were incredible, you know, because they believed in it, and there was that trust, and that's the biggest thing. There's got to be that trust.
Well, thank you for sharing your story and your experience with that. And I think it really leads to this idea of collaboration versus consultation. A lot of times now, consultation is what happens. It's a checkbox. We talk to the people. That's it. And collaboration is what's going to be the key to telling these stories. And in my own experience with the Indigenous communities that I've worked with, I spend a year and a half prior to doing any work just being in that community, working, building the trust, getting to know people, and then we proceed. And I think it also, from the outset, speaks to the importance of making sure that once you decide a project is going to happen, it's not just about what me as the archaeologist wants to find out. It is setting those research priorities with the community. What do they want to know? What aligns with them? What are they after? And it shifts, I think, where I'm seeing things back in Canada right now is we're having a conversation about Indigenous data sovereignty. And so at the end, yes, all archaeologists have to write a report of some sort. But we're trying to advocate for the fact that if we've done work with this Indigenous community and we've done work for them, this report and everything that we have found belongs to them, and it is up to them whether they share it with anybody else.
They might say no.
Yeah.
The council in Klawak had to really work out with all the elders, do we want them to continue? Because the remains were found and they stopped and went back to the communities. And then they said, no, go to Klawak. If we have concerns, we'll work through them. So the Klawak Council had to really, they worked long and hard to figure out, what does our community believe? Do we want them to continue this work up there? And they decided yes, because they said, our uncles are still teaching us. Find out what it is. So that was the go-ahead to, because that's what happens in our culture. The uncles are teaching his sister's children and the ants are doing that for the women. So it was a young man, and he had a deep sea diet, and he was doing a lot of flint knapping, and the obsidian, a lot of different materials were used in the flint knapping, but there was obsidian, and you might know that each volcano has its own chemical signature. Not every volcano spits out the same stuff in the exact same ratio. So you can tell from looking at what chemicals are in the obsidian that you have, what volcano it came from. So they did the testing, and it was Suez Island, which is further to the west from Prince of Wales, and the other one was Mount Edziza in British Columbia. Well, how did he get that stuff? Either he knew how to get to those places, or there was a trade network. So that opens up the idea, wow, this wasn't covered with ice and snow 10,000 years ago or more. And so, and it took a few years before DNA was cheaper to do. They didn't do it at first, and that's when they were able to find out that he was a young male, because we had the lower jaw, and that summer we found the 2 teeth that were missing in that jaw. He had indentations in the teeth where he was probably using sinew or something, and it, carved those little grooves in his teeth. And then he had a deep sea diet. So at 430 feet, he's got a deep sea diet. So that said that the water level was higher, and that he had to have gotten there by water, not over a land bridge. So there's a lot more that could have been done, but that 10 years, they were ready because they couldn't figure out what more tests can we do. It was time to give it back to the community. So the community, if they want to do more tests, they're going to have to go back to the community council in Kloak, and can we go dig them up again? But I like that they said yes, because our uncles want to teach us something.
Yeah, and I really think that speaks to this idea that these are not just objects and artifacts. These are people's belongings. There are stories behind them. Right, and I think we've got about 5 minutes left if we've got any more questions.
I just had a follow-up question about the DNA. Did they test it to see where he came from and if he still has living descendants?
This is a long time ago, so the database that existed only had 300 samples in it. So he did match the Chumash in California, a spot in Mexico, and a spot in South America, and a spot in Ohio. So because there was a United States spot in California, that's how NAGPRA really kicked in, and they were going to have to follow all the rules for that. At the time, there weren't that many Alaskans in that database, and may have matched, but there's just this, you could have left it out there. Like, the Kennewick man still hasn't been finished. And what happened with our guy was at 10 years, he was reburied, and it's done. And somebody could go back to the council and say, can we do more of this or that? Because things have gotten better since the late 90s. But nobody has asked to go back yet. And you still look at the Kennewick man, and they're still fighting over who gets him. And until then, they're not allowed to do any work on him. So that one was not a good experience archaeologically. Yeah, so we were happy to have that DNA done, and it was Brian Kemp who did the DNA work with help from, I think the guy was from Finland or someplace in that part of the world. Yeah. And so we were happy that he was willing to get involved and get that part of the study done. And then to find out, well, this really does throw a monkey wrench into migration. You know, to have a deep sea diet, but yet he's got spots that he matches all the way down to South America.
All right. I don't think we're going to get any more questions. So thanks, everyone, for joining. And yeah, I think this really demonstrates how archaeology can be done differently. Thanks.